I was still standing at the podium, the applause for my product launch barely fading, when my boss leaned in with that corporate smile that never reached his eyes. "Time for you to start thinking about retirement," he said, loud enough for the marketing team and the investors to hear. I froze, my hand still on the mic. The launch we'd just pulled off would double the company's annual revenue, and I'd spent 2 years sacrificing weekends, relationships, and my health to make it happen. The champagne glasses around us caught the light from the stage, and cameras flashed as reporters captured what should have been my moment of triumph. My cheeks burned, but I smiled back, just as he liked, while my mind was already writing a different ending for him. The investors chuckled awkwardly, unsure if Miles was joking. I knew he wasn't. "Of course, Miles," I said sweetly into the microphone, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Whatever's best for the company." The crowd applauded again, thinking it was part of some planned exchange, but I locked eyes with Miles as I stepped off the stage, and something in my expression made his smug smile falter for just a second. He had no idea what he'd just started. My name is Monica Dyer, and at 49 I'd built my career like a fortress brick by brick. I wasn't just good at my job. I was the reason Oracle Technologies had survived the last 3 years. While other companies in our sector were laying off employees and cutting budgets, we were thriving. And that success had my fingerprints all over it. I joined Oracle 12 years ago as a senior product manager, back when Miles was just another ambitious VP trying to climb the corporate ladder. I watched him charm his way to the top, while I did the actual work that kept our division profitable. He had the smooth talk and designer suits. I had the supplier relationships, the technical knowledge, and the client trust that actually made things happen. The product we just launched, the AutoFlow logistics system, was my baby. I'd spent 2 years nurturing it from a rough concept to a revolutionary platform that would transform how companies manage their supply chains. Every late night, every weekend, every missed dinner with friends had led to this moment. And Miles had just publicly suggested I should retire right after delivering him the biggest win of his career. What he didn't know was that this win was entirely dependent on systems only I controlled. 6 months earlier, Miles had shown his true colors during a routine lunch meeting with our development team. I'd spent weeks preparing a presentation on cost-saving measures for our struggling logistics division. The numbers were solid, the strategy was clear, and the potential savings were enormous. I presented my findings to the team, watching faces light up as they realized how much money we could save by streamlining our vendor relationships. Miles nodded along, asked a few surface-level questions, then wrapped up the meeting with his usual charm. 2 weeks later, I sat in the monthly board meeting and watched him present my entire strategy as his own brilliant idea. He stood at the front of the room, clicking through slides I'd created, explaining concepts I'd developed, and basking in the praise from our executive team. When the board approved the plan and congratulated Miles on his innovative thinking, I felt something crack inside me. Not break. Crack. Like the first hairline fracture in a dam that looks perfectly solid from the outside. Miles caught my eye afterward and winked, as if we shared some inside joke. That's when I realized he saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. I started planning that very day. The opportunity came during our contract negotiations for the AutoFlow project. We needed specialized software licensing agreements with 3 key suppliers, companies I'd worked with for years and who trusted me completely. Miles was focused on the big picture and the media attention, so he left the boring legal stuff to me. I carefully crafted the contracts with a seemingly minor clause that specified the licensing agreements were tied to my direct oversight and approval. To anyone reading quickly, it looked like standard language ensuring continuity of supplier relationships. But the wording was very specific. If I left the company, the suppliers had the right to terminate their agreements within 30 days. Miles signed off on everything without reading the fine print. He was too busy planning his victory speeches and scheduling interviews with trade publications. He trusted me to handle the details, never imagining I might have my own interests in mind. The suppliers signed eagerly. They knew my reputation in the industry and were happy to have their contracts tied to my continued involvement. One of them even mentioned how rare it was to find someone who understood both the technical and business sides of their operations. I filed the contracts away, knowing I'd just given myself the ultimate insurance policy. In the green room after the launch event, I was touching up my lipstick when I heard Miles's voice through the thin wall. He was talking to our VP of operations, and they clearly didn't know I could hear every word. "She's past her prime," Miles said, his voice carrying that casual cruelty I'd learned to recognize. "Monica's good at what she does, but we need fresh blood. Someone who can really take this product to the next level." "But she just delivered the biggest launch in company history," the VP replied, sounding confused. Miles laughed, that harsh sound he made when he thought he was being clever. "That's exactly why it's time to move her out. She's peaked. We'll bring in someone younger, more dynamic, someone who can build on what she's done without being stuck in old ways of thinking." I set down my lipstick and stared at my reflection. My hands were perfectly steady, but inside, I felt that crack in the dam widen just a little more. Not from sadness, from pure, cold anger. I walked back out to the reception with my brightest smile, accepting congratulations and making small talk with investors. But I was already calculating timelines in my head. Miles wanted me gone? Fine. But he was going to learn the hard way what fresh blood actually costs. The investor dinner was held at the city's most exclusive restaurant, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. I played the perfect hostess, making sure everyone had their preferred drinks and steering conversations toward topics that would make them feel important and heard. But I also made sure to casually mention the unique supplier relationships that made AutoFlow possible. Nothing dramatic. Just little comments here and there about how long it had taken to build trust with our key vendors, how they specifically requested to work with me on future projects, how these partnerships were the real secret to our competitive advantage. Monica's relationships in the industry are irreplaceable, I heard one investor tell another during dessert. 12 years of building these connections, you can't just hire that kind of network. Miles was holding court at the other end of the table, entertaining everyone with stories about his vision for the company's future. He didn't seem to notice the subtle shift in how investors looked at me when I spoke about technical challenges or supplier negotiations. I made sure to sit next to our biggest investor, a sharp woman named Patricia, who'd made her fortune in manufacturing. When she asked about succession planning for key roles, I just smiled and said, "Well, the industry relationships really are personal. You can't just transfer decades of trust overnight." Patricia nodded slowly, filing that information away. I started having lunch with competitors the very next week. Nothing dramatic or suspicious, just industry networking. Meetings that happened to occur in restaurants where our employees sometimes ate. I made sure word would eventually leak back to Miles, but I wanted it to seem accidental. The first meeting was with Nash Harrison, COO of our biggest rival, Nirvana Solutions. I'd known Nash for years through industry conferences, and when I suggested we catch up over lunch, he was eager to meet, especially after hearing about AutoFlow's massive success. "You've really outdone yourself with this launch," Nash said, cutting into his steak. "Our whole team is scrambling to figure out how you pulled off those supplier agreements. Some of those vendors won't even return our calls." I smiled modestly. "It's all about relationships. I've been working with these companies since before they were major players. Trust takes time to build." Nash leaned forward, clearly interested. "You know, we've been looking for someone with your expertise. Someone who really understands the vendor landscape." I deflected gracefully, but made sure the conversation continued long enough that Miles's assistant, who happened to be picking up lunch from the same restaurant, would see us together. She was notorious for office gossip, and I counted on that information making its way upstairs within hours. By the end of the week, I had similar lunches with 2 other competitors. The word was spreading exactly as I'd planned. The first crack appeared during a routine supplier call. Our biggest vendor, Nimbus Logistics, had a question about expanding their contract for the next quarter. It should have been a simple conversation, but Miles insisted on taking the lead to build his own relationships. I watched from across the conference room as he fumbled through the call. He didn't understand the technical specifications, couldn't answer basic questions about implementation timelines, and worst of all, he tried to negotiate terms that had already been finalized months ago. "I think there might be some confusion," Nimbus's CEO said politely. "Monica and I worked out these details back in March. The rates and delivery schedules are already locked in." Miles shot me a look, clearly expecting me to jump in and save him. Instead, I smiled encouragingly and gestured for him to continue. "You've got this," I mouthed silently. He didn't have it. The call ended with Nimbus requesting a follow-up meeting with the person who actually understands our agreement. After Miles hung up, he was sweating despite the air conditioning. "They seemed a little confused," I said innocently. "Maybe they're just used to dealing with me directly. I can clean that up later." Miles nodded quickly, grateful for the lifeline. He had no idea I just let him publicly demonstrate his incompetence to one of our most important partners. That afternoon, Nimbus's CEO called me directly on my personal phone. Instead of addressing his obvious lack of technical knowledge, Miles doubled down on pushing me aside. He promoted Silas Warner, a 32-year-old manager from our marketing department, to shadow me and learn the ropes of product development. Silas had an MBA from a good school, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being truly tested. He wore expensive watches and talked about disrupting industries he didn't understand. Miles clearly saw himself in Silas, all ambition and charm, light on substance. "Monica's going to teach you everything she knows," Miles announced during our weekly team meeting. "Silas is going to be our future in product development." Silas smiled at me with that particular brand of arrogance young executives mistake for leadership. "I'm really excited to learn from your experience," he said, emphasizing experience in a way that made it sound like a polite word for outdated. I smiled back sweetly. "I'll teach you everything you need to know." What Silas didn't realize was that everything he needed to know and everything I actually knew were two very different things. I was about to give him just enough rope to hang himself, and Miles right alongside him. Over the next few weeks, I'd make sure Silas felt confident and prepared, while ensuring he was actually walking into every possible trap. Training Silas was like watching an eager student who only wanted to learn the answers, not understand the questions. He took notes on everything I told him, but never asked about the why behind my decisions. He wanted the shortcuts and formulas, not the deeper knowledge that comes from years of trial and error. I taught him the basics of our supplier relationships, but left out the crucial details. I explained our contract structures, but not the personal agreements that made them work. I showed him our pricing models, but not the flexibility built into them for special circumstances. "So Nimbus Logistics always ships on Thursdays?" Silas asked, scribbling in his notebook. "Usually," I said, which was technically true. What I didn't mention was that usually meant unless there's a hurricane, a holiday, a major client emergency, or any of 24 other exceptions that required personal intervention. Silas nodded confidently. "Got it. Thursdays." When he asked about our contract with Orion Holding Systems, I explained the standard terms, but failed to mention the informal understanding I had with their CEO about rush orders. Silas wrote down the official protocol and assumed that was the whole story. By the end of his training, Silas had a notebook full of procedures and policies. What he didn't have was any understanding of how to handle the inevitable moments when procedures break down and relationships matter more than rules. I made sure he felt completely prepared for his first solo presentation. Silas's big moment came during a quarterly review with Orion Holding Systems, one of our most important clients. Their team had flown in specifically to discuss expanding their contract time, and Miles wanted Silas to take the lead to show off our next generation of leadership. I sat in the back of the conference room, watching Silas confidently flip through his presentation slides. He'd prepared thoroughly, hit all the key points, and delivered everything exactly as I'd taught him, which was exactly the problem. When Orion Holdings' CEO asked about accommodating rush orders during their peak season, Silas stuck to the script. "Our standard protocol allows for expedited delivery with 72-hour notice," he said, reading straight from his notes. The CEO's eyebrows rose slightly. That's different from what Monica and I discussed. We've always been able to arrange same-day delivery for critical orders. Silas looked confused and glanced back at me. I gave him an encouraging smile, but didn't say anything. He turned back to the client, clearly flustered. Well, I'm sure we can work something out, but policy is policy. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Orion Holdings' team exchanged glances, and their CEO's expression went from friendly to coldly professional. I see. And this policy change is effective immediately? Miles jumped in, sweating visibly, but he didn't understand the technical details any better than Silas did. The meeting ended with Orion Holdings requesting time to reassess their options. Silas looked like he'd been hit by a truck. After the Orion Holdings disaster, Miles called me into his office for what he called a team alignment conversation. Silas sat in the corner chair, looking like a scolded puppy, while Miles paced behind his desk trying to project authority. I need you to be a better team player, Miles said, his voice carrying that fake friendly tone he used when he was actually furious. Silas is the future of this division, and part of your job is making sure he succeeds. I nodded seriously. Of course, I want Silas to succeed. Then why didn't you jump in when things went sideways with Orion Holdings? Miles demanded. You just sat there and watched him struggle. I tilted my head, looking genuinely confused. But you said Silas should take the lead. I thought jumping in would undermine his authority with the client? Isn't that exactly what you didn't want me to do? Miles opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing I'd trapped him with his own instructions. Silas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Going forward, Miles continued, I need you to let Silas shine. Give him space to grow into the role. Stop hovering over every decision. Absolutely, I agreed. Silas should have the freedom to handle things his way. That's how people learn best. Miles looked satisfied with my compliance. Silas actually smiled a little, thinking he'd been given more independence. Neither of them realized I'd just been given official permission to stop saving them from their own mistakes. 2 weeks later, our finance department requested a complete audit of the product division's records. It was routine, just quarterly documentation to ensure everything was properly categorized for tax purposes. But it required someone who understood the intricate coding system I'd developed over the years. Every supplier agreement, every licensing fee, every development cost had been filed using a system that made perfect sense to me, but looked like gibberish to anyone else. I'd built it organically over time, adding new categories and subcategories as our business grew more complex. Miles waved off the audit request when finance first mentioned it. Monica can handle that later, he said. It's not urgent. But finance insisted they needed the documentation within 2 weeks for their quarterly review. When Miles finally told me about it, I was already packing for a long overdue vacation. Can't this wait until you get back? He asked, clearly annoyed. I shook my head sympathetically. The audit deadline is firm, but I'm sure Silas can handle it. He's been learning all our systems, and this would be great experience for him. Miles looked uncertain, but Silas jumped at the opportunity. I've got this, he said confidently. How hard can filing be? I spent an hour showing Silas where the files were stored, but the coding system would take weeks to fully explain. Instead, I gave him the basic overview and assured him he'd figure out the rest. You're so smart, I told him. I know you'll do great. My vacation was perfectly timed, 2 weeks during the busiest product rollout month of the year. AutoFlow was launching with 3 major clients simultaneously, requiring constant coordination between suppliers, delivery teams, and customer service. Under normal circumstances, I would never have left during such a critical period. But these weren't normal circumstances. I flew to a small island resort with spotty internet connection and limited cell service. Officially, I was unreachable for genuine emergencies. Unofficially, I made sure Miles's calls went straight to voicemail while I sipped margaritas on the beach. The first few days were blissfully quiet. Then my phone started buzzing constantly. Miles called 6 times on Tuesday. Silas called 4 times on Wednesday. By Thursday, I had 17 missed calls and a string of increasingly panicked text messages. Orders are backed up. Nimbus Logistics is confused about delivery schedules. Orion Holdings wants to speak to you specifically. Silas can't find the vendor contact information. Call me back. I answered exactly one call on Friday afternoon, timing it perfectly to catch Miles at his most desperate. Monica, thank God, he said, his voice strained. We really need you to walk Silas through some of these processes. I sighed sympathetically. I wish I could help, but I'm completely offline here. The internet is terrible. I'm sure Silas can figure it out. He's so capable. The call cut out. Whether from bad connection or Miles throwing his phone, I couldn't tell. By the time I returned from vacation, the damage was spectacular. Silas had mixed up delivery schedules, sent the wrong product specifications to 2 different clients, and somehow managed to double book our entire shipping capacity for the same week. Nimbus Logistics had received conflicting instructions about a major delivery and had stopped all shipments until they could get clear direction from Monica. Orion Holdings had escalated their complaints to the CEO level after Silas tried to charge them for services that were included in their contract. Most embarrassingly, Silas had completely failed the audit. He'd submitted a random collection of documents that made no sense to finance, forcing them to request an extension and raising questions about our internal organization. Miles was waiting at my desk when I arrived Monday morning, coffee-stained and looking like he hadn't slept in days. "How was your vacation?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Wonderful," I said brightly, settling into my chair. "Very relaxing. It looks like things got a little busy while I was gone." Miles's eye twitched. Silas ran into some challenges. I looked around the office, taking in the obvious chaos. Employees were rushing between desks, phones were ringing constantly, and Silas was nowhere to be seen. "Where is Silas?" I asked innocently. "Sick day," Miles muttered. "Food poisoning." I nodded sympathetically, knowing full well that Silas was probably hiding in his apartment, too humiliated to face the office after his spectacular failures. "Well," I said, rolling up my sleeves, "I guess I better get started fixing things." The quarterly investor meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Miles was clearly panicking. The numbers looked terrible, not because Autoflow wasn't successful, but because the chaos of the past month had created massive inefficiencies and client complaints. I watched Miles practice his presentation in the conference room, sweating through his shirt as he tried to explain why our most successful product launch had somehow resulted in decreased customer satisfaction scores and delayed deliveries. "We experienced some temporary growing pains," he kept saying, but even he didn't sound convinced. The board members filed in looking skeptical. Patricia, our biggest investor, took her usual seat at the far end of the table and immediately started flipping through the quarterly reports with a frown. Miles began his presentation with forced enthusiasm, but the questions started almost immediately. Why are our delivery metrics down if the product is so successful? What happened with the Orion Holdings contract dispute? Who's responsible for these supplier communication breakdowns? I sat quietly in my chair, taking notes and offering no input unless directly asked. When Patricia finally turned to me, her question was simple but loaded. "Monica, in your opinion, what would it take to get our operations back on track?" I paused thoughtfully, as if considering the question carefully. "Well, consistency is key. Our suppliers and clients need to know they're working with people who understand their needs and can deliver on promises." Miles's face went pale as the implications sank in. After the disastrous investor meeting, Miles went into full damage control mode. He called an all-hands meeting and announced that the recent transition challenges were completely under control and that the company remained committed to developing next-generation leadership. "Silas Warner will continue to play a key role in our product development strategy," Miles declared to a room full of skeptical faces. "We're confident that the learning curve is behind us." I almost felt sorry for Silas, who was clearly trying to disappear into his chair. He'd returned from his sick day, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 1 week. Several employees exchanged glances. Everyone had heard about the client complaints and delivery delays. They'd watched Silas struggle with basic tasks that I'd been handling smoothly for years. After the meeting, I overheard 2 developers talking by the coffee machine. "Think Monica's going to stick around?" one asked quietly. After this mess? I'd be looking for other options, the other replied. Word was spreading that key employees were updating their resumes. The confidence in Miles's leadership was cracking, and everyone could feel it. That afternoon, I received an email that would change everything. The subject line read, "Confidential Opportunity. Nirvana Solutions. Nash Harrison wanted to meet again, and this time he was bringing an official offer. The Nirvana Solutions offer was everything Miles should have given me years ago. Senior Vice President of Product Development, a salary that was nearly double what I was making at Oracle, my own team of 25 people, and most importantly, complete autonomy over supplier relationships and product strategy. But the real game changer was the licensing clause. Nirvana Solutions was willing to let me bring my supplier agreements with me, recognizing them as personal business relationships rather than company property. They'd done their homework and knew exactly how valuable my network was. I read through the contract twice, making sure I understood every detail. The start date was flexible, but Nash suggested I begin in 6 weeks, right before Oracle's next major product evaluation meeting. "We've been watching what happened over there," Nash said during our final negotiation meeting. "Your boss has no idea what he's about to lose." I smiled and signed the contract. 6 weeks sounds perfect. What Miles didn't know was that my departure would trigger the termination clauses in all 3 major supplier agreements. Nimbus Logistics, Orion Holdings Systems, and our licensing partner would all have the legal right to walk away from their contracts within 30 days of my leaving. And based on my conversations with their executives over the past few months, they were all prepared to do exactly that. Nash handed me a welcome packet that included business cards with my new title. "Ready to start over?" "I'm ready to start winning," I replied. I waited until the perfect moment to drop the bomb. Miles had scheduled a private meeting to discuss my future with the company, clearly planning to either force me out or negotiate some face-saving transition. He had no idea I was about to make the transition completely unnecessary. "Monica, I've been thinking about our conversation after the investor meeting," Miles began, settling into his chair with his usual false confidence. "Maybe it's time we talked about a gradual retirement plan, something that would let you step back while Silas takes on more responsibility." I nodded thoughtfully. "That's interesting timing, Miles." "Oh, I've actually been thinking about my future too." I pulled out the Nirvana Solutions contract and set it on his desk. "I've accepted a position with Nirvana Solutions, Senior VP of Product Development. I start in 3 weeks. Miles's face went through several different expressions: confusion, shock, anger, and finally panic. "You can't be serious." "Completely serious. Nash Harrison made me an offer I couldn't refuse." Miles started flipping through the contract, his hands shaking slightly. "Your non-compete clause only applies to directly competing products," I interrupted. "Nirvana Solutions' business model is different enough that legal already cleared it. But the suppliers are agreements." I smiled sweetly. "What about them?" Miles grabbed the supplier contracts from his filing cabinet, probably reading the termination clauses for the first time since signing them. His face went white as he realized what my departure actually meant. "They can all walk away," he whispered. "If they choose to," I agreed. "But I'm sure Silas can rebuild those relationships." The emergency board meeting was called for the following Monday. Miles spent the weekend frantically trying to contact our suppliers and convince them to stay, but Nimbus Logistics had already submitted their termination notice. Orion Holdings was reviewing their options, and our licensing partner wanted to meet with Miles personally before making any decisions. When I walked into the boardroom that morning, the atmosphere was tense. Patricia looked furious, and the other investors were clearly demanding answers. "Before we begin," I said calmly, "I should inform everyone that I've accepted a position with Nirvana Solutions. This will be my final meeting with Oracle Technologies." The silence was deafening. Patricia was the first to speak. "When do you start?" "Next Monday. And the supplier agreements will need to be renegotiated by whoever takes over product development." Miles jumped in desperately. "Monica, surely we can work something out, a counteroffer, better terms." I shook my head. "I've already signed with Nirvana Solutions. They're very excited about the supplier relationships I'll be bringing to their platform. The implication hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Not only was I leaving, but I was taking everything that made Autoflow successful directly to their biggest competitor. Patricia stood up slowly. Miles, I think the board needs to discuss this privately. But without you. I gathered my things and walked toward the door. As I reached the threshold, I turned back to Miles one final time. By the way, thank you for that advice about retirement. It really helped me think about my future. Miles was removed from his CEO position within 48 hours. The board voted unanimously to bring in an interim leader while they searched for permanent replacement. Silas was reassigned to marketing, and several other executives found themselves suddenly exploring new opportunities. I cleaned out my desk on Friday afternoon, surrounded by boxes of files and personal items accumulated over 12 years. Several employees stopped by to say goodbye, and more than a few asked if Nirvana Solutions was hiring. Put in an application, I told them. I might have some input on the hiring process. Nimbus Logistics officially terminated their contract that same day, followed by Orion Holdings on Monday. Our licensing partner agreed to honor their existing commitments, but refused to renew for the following year. Autoflow was still technically functional, but without the supplier network that made it competitive, it was essentially worthless. Miles had gone from hero to zero in less than a month, and the technology press was already writing articles about Oracle's spectacular implosion. I picked up my last box and walked toward the elevator. The security guard who'd greeted me every morning for over a decade tipped his hat. "Good luck, Miss Dyer," he said quietly. "Give 'em hell," I smiled. "I intend to." My first day at Nirvana Solutions felt like stepping into an alternate universe where competence was valued and experience was respected. Nash Harrison personally introduced me to my new team, and I could see the excitement in their faces when he explained my background and the supplier relationships I was bringing with me. Monica built the Autoflow system from the ground up, Nash told the assembled group. She's going to help us build something even better. My new office overlooked the harbor, with floor-to-ceiling windows and enough space for a proper conference table. On my desk was a welcome gift from the team, a coffee mug that read, "Senior VP of Making Things Actually Work." Within my first week, Nimbus Logistics had signed an exclusive partnership agreement with Nirvana Solutions. Orion Holdings followed 2 days later, bringing their entire contract, worth millions in annual revenue, directly from Oracle to our platform. Nash stopped by my office at the end of my first week, grinning broadly. "How does it feel to be on the winning side?" I looked out at the harbor, where boats moved smoothly through calm water. "It feels like coming home,"